Hello, everybody. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway. I'm glad you joined me for this particular message. I want to talk to you a little bit about being passed over. The season of Passover for the Jewish people ended last night, Saturday evening at sundown, and it is a time of not just the Passover celebration of the Passover Seder, but it also includes the next 7 days after that, which is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that altogether is called the Passover season, or the Peshek, as the Jewish people used to call it. It is an interesting feast. It is reflective of several very important things, and I had not realized how important it really was in the New Testament. It is mentioned many, many times in the New Testament. It's mentioned 4 times in the Gospels, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In fact, it's mentioned more directly than the word Passover because it reflected really the Jewish thinking. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was an important event in the Jewish people, among the Jewish people. It was one of the 3 major feasts of the Jewish year. These feasts were very important because they were called pilgrimage feasts or gathering feasts. They were a time when all the male Jewish people who were living in the area of Palestine were required to come to Jerusalem to celebrate these 3 feasts. The feasts were the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, which we call Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Those 3 were called gathering feasts or pilgrimage feasts. And if you lived in Palestine, you were expected, if you were a Jewish man, to be at that feast. In fact, it was such a serious matter that if you were of the Pharisee class, if you weren't in Jerusalem during that feast, you were considered to be outside of the Jewish faith, and that is quite important. So when it talks about this being the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in Luke and in Mark and in Matthew, it's identified that way. The night of the Passover that Jesus celebrated with his disciples was said to be the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so that is important to understand. This feast was very, very important to the early Christian church. Paul identifies it in the book of Acts as a feast that he waits until after it's passed before he sails back to Antioch and then from there to Jerusalem. He stops actually right after the feast in the port city of Ephesus, where he can spend time with the disciples there and talking to them about his upcoming trip to Jerusalem. And so it's important to understand that this Feast of Unleavened Bread was important in the thinking of the early Christian church. We kind of moved away from that after the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and the growing gulf between Orthodox Judaism, or what we call Rabbinic Judaism, and the Christian faith that happened in the decades following that. And so the Feast of Unleavened Bread came to have less and less importance in the Christian faith. But Paul considered it so important that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he talked very specifically about the importance and the metaphorical meaning of this feast for Christians. He talks about the purity that it represents. And if you go back to the concept of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as it's laid out in Exodus chapter 12, you will see why Paul directs us that way, to talk to us about the purity angle. The unleavened bread was a symbol, or had become a symbol or a metaphor for purity of the Jewish people. They were taken out of the land of Egypt, and on that night of Passover, they ate unleavened bread, but because they left so quickly, they were not able to ferment bread for the travel, so they actually had to eat unleavened bread for the first 7 days following their exodus out of the land of Egypt. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread was to continually remind them that God had called them away from Egypt, had called them away from that lifestyle into something brand new, had called them to be his people and to follow him with a complete commitment and heart. It was also an indication of a separation from idolatry. In another passage in the Old Testament, it is directly connected with this concept of not giving in to idols and not making idols for yourself. And so Paul directs us back to this concept in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where he is talking about living our lives, as it were, in the desert and on the journey to where God is taking us. And we are eating the unleavened bread. We are following along as being God's people. And he tells us we can't partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. We can't take a part of each of those. We can't be involved in idolatry in our hearts. And so Paul is quite pointed about that concept. So when we talk about this Passover concept, it is critical for us to understand that. Another thought that was tied with this is the idea that the blood of the Passover literally allowed us to escape the wrath of God. Connected again with this concept of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the concept of the value of the firstborn. In fact, in one of the passages in the Old Testament that deals with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it talks specifically about the firstborn male that comes from the womb belongs to the Lord, and it must be either redeemed or given wholly to him. And so that is important in this concept. God has rescued us through his firstborn Son, Jesus Christ, who is the firstborn of all creation, as the New Testament tells us. He is the one who gave his life, and just as the firstborn of the Egyptians were killed on that first night of Passover as the angel of death passed through the land of Egypt, so all the firstborn of Israel belonged to God because he had redeemed them in that experience. For us to understand how important this is, it is critical to our understanding of salvation. Jesus is called in the New Testament our Passover lamb in Hebrews, and that it's important for us to understand that Jesus, his blood is what has been placed, as it were, on the heart doorposts and lintel, and has through that allowed the wrath of God to pass over us, to pass beyond us, and allowed us to live a new and fresh and dynamic life in Christ. And we have gone out through that door on the Exodus, as it were, heading to that new kingdom, as the writer of Hebrews tells us, that we are citizens of that new kingdom, that we are headed toward that kingdom. We are looking forward to it. It's where God has called us to. And that's what God's called you and I to. So when we look at this Feast of Unleavened Bread, we need to understand that God is calling us to purity. He's calling us to hearts that are devoted to him alone. He is calling us to come on this journey of Exodus and go with him to the city and become his people in a real sense of the word. And so those are the things that we're spoken to when we're talking about being passed over. we have been passed over by God's wrath, and he has instead looked upon us with his grace and with his favor. And so we celebrate this day as, in its sense, the journey. We are on the journey with Christ to that new kingdom. God bless you. You have a wonderful week. We'll talk to you in church hopefully soon. God bless. Bye-bye.